Imagine standing in a room. The air is cold. It smells like expensive carpet, old paper, and executive coffee. Across from you sits a man in a $3,000 custom-tailored suit. He isn't looking at your face. He's looking at his watch. He sighs, slides a thin manila folder across the mahogany table, and says 7 words that change everything. We don't waste time on pocket change. The year is 2011. The man in the suit is Arthur Vance, Senior Vice President of Legal Affairs for one of the largest banking institutions in the country. The man sitting across from him is Arthur's worst nightmare. Except, Arthur doesn't know it yet. To Arthur, the man sitting across the table is just Thomas. Thomas is 62 years old. He wears a faded gray tweed jacket with a slight fray on the left cuff. He drives a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the passenger door. And his entire legal claim against the bank, the reason he spent his last $70 on gas and parking to get to this skyscraper, is worth exactly $400. $400. To a bank that manages $84 billion in assets, $400 is a rounding error. It's less than the cost of the leather chair Arthur Vance is currently leaning back in. Arthur smiles. It isn't a warm smile. It's the kind of smile a wolf gives a sheep before it decides which leg to bite first. Mr. Jennings, Arthur says, his voice smooth, practiced, and entirely devoid of human empathy. We have reviewed your complaint regarding the service fees on your late mother's checking account. While we understand your frustration, the bank's policy is absolute. The fees stand. Here is a waiver. Sign it, and we will credit your account $50 as a gesture of goodwill. If you decline, you're welcome to file a lawsuit. But let me be clear. Arthur leans forward. The gold links on his cuffs catch the harsh fluorescent light. Our legal retainer costs more per minute than your mother's account accumulated in a decade. We will tie you up in motions until your grandchildren are paying off your legal debt. Choose wisely. Thomas looks down at the waiver. Then he looks at the $50 credit offer. He doesn't look angry. He doesn't look intimidated. In fact, if Arthur Vance had been paying closer attention, if he hadn't been so blinded by his own corporate armor, he would have noticed something incredibly unsettling. Thomas's hands aren't shaking. He slowly reaches into his breast pocket. He doesn't pull out a pen to sign the waiver. Instead, he pulls out an old, yellowed piece of paper folded into a tight square. He doesn't open it. He just places it gently on top of the $50 offer. I figured you'd say something like that, Thomas says. His voice is quiet, low, grounded. But before I leave, I think you should read line 14. To understand how Thomas ended up in that high-rise office, facing down a corporate dragon over a few crisp $100 bills, we have to go back 3 months earlier. It started in a dusty garage. Thomas's mother, Margaret, had passed away at the age of 86. She was a woman of simple habits. She saved rubber bands. She washed out plastic Ziploc bags to reuse them. And she kept every single financial document she had ever signed in a green metal filing cabinet behind the lawnmower. Thomas was going through the files, a cup of lukewarm black coffee in his hand, when he found her final bank statement. The balance was small, just a few $1,000s left over from her modest pension. But down at the bottom, listed under transactions, was a charge that made Thomas pause. Monthly inactivity fee, $45. Administrative ledger maintenance, $55. Legacy account surcharge, $300. Total withheld, $400. Thomas frowned. His mother hadn't used the account because she had been in a hospice care facility for the last 6 months of her life. The bank knew this. He had sent them the medical power of attorney paperwork himself. The next morning, Thomas went to the local branch. It was a small branch with glass double doors and a young manager named Kevin who looked like he had started shaving last Tuesday. Thomas explained the situation calmly. He brought the death certificate. He brought the hospice bills. It's just $400, Kevin, Thomas said, his tone conversational. It seems like a mistake. She wasn't inactive by choice. She was dying. Kevin looked at the screen. He clicked his mouse 3 times. Then he gave Thomas a look that was a mix of boredom and pity. The system generates these charges automatically, Mr. Jennings. Once they are posted, they can't be reversed. It's standard corporate policy for accounts that fall below a certain balance threshold. But she didn't fall below the threshold until you took the fees, Thomas pointed out. Reasonably. Kevin shrugged. Policy is policy. There's nothing I can do. Thomas sat there for a moment. He looked at Kevin's neat little desk, his neat little nameplate, and his neat little corporate tie. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't demand to see his supervisor. He just nodded, stood up, and walked out. Most people would have stopped there. They would have gone home, grumbled to their spouse over dinner about how greedy big banks are, and eventually forgotten about the $400. After all, what is $400 compared to the stress of a legal battle against an institution with a multi-million-dollar legal department? But Thomas wasn't most people. Before he retired, Thomas had worked for 32 years as a land surveyor and title researcher for the county. If you have ever met a title researcher, you know one thing to be absolutely true: they do not read documents like normal humans. They read the fine print. They read the footnotes. They read the asterisks that require a magnifying glass to see. They are people who find joy in uncovering a property dispute from 1842 based on the placement of an old oak tree that died during the Civil War. When Thomas got home, he didn't go into the kitchen. He went straight back to the dusty garage. He dragged the green metal filing cabinet out into the light. He didn't look at the 2011 documents. He didn't look at the 2000 documents. He went all the way to the back of the bottom drawer, to a folder marked in his mother's neat, cursive handwriting, First National Bank opening documents. The date on the folder was October 12, 1969. The document inside was beautiful in a way modern documents aren't. It wasn't printed on a laser printer. It was typed on a heavy mechanical typewriter. The ink was slightly raised off the thick, parchment-like paper. It bore the original logo of First National Bank, a bank that had long since been acquired, merged, swallowed up, and rebranded 3 different times before becoming the global banking giant that Arthur Vance represented today. Thomas sat at his kitchen table under a single hanging light bulb. He put on his reading glasses. He got out a yellow highlighter, and he began to read. Page 1, page 2, page 3. Most of it was standard 1969 banking jargon. Terms about deposit limits, passbook requirements, and check clearance times. But then Thomas reached page 4. Section 12, Amendments and Modifications. Section 13, Governing Law. And then there it was. Section 14, Indemnity, Continuity, and Sovereign Rate Guarantees. Thomas read the paragraph once. He stopped. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put his glasses back on. He read it a second time. Slowly, word by word. A tiny, slow smile began to form on Thomas's face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just found a perfectly preserved set of tracks in the snow. Well, Thomas whispered to the empty kitchen. He got out a legal pad and a calculator. He began to type in numbers. He calculated the interest. Then he calculated the compounding intervals. Then he adjusted for the specific penalty clauses outlined in paragraph 3 of section 14. He finished his first set of calculations. He stared at the number on the little digital screen. That can't be right, he said aloud. He cleared the calculator and did again. He changed the compounding frequency from annual to monthly, exactly as the 1969 text dictated for unauthorized institutional withholding. The number got bigger. He did a third time, checking his work against the historical prime interest rates from 1974, 1982, and 1998. When he was done, the final number was staring back at him in stark, green liquid crystal. Thomas didn't go to bed that night. He stayed up until 4 a.m., printing out historical interest rate charts, copying corporate merger successorship laws, and binding them all together in a neat professional folder. The next morning, he called the bank's corporate headquarters. He didn't ask for customer service. He asked for the legal department. It took him 3 days of being transferred, hung up on, and put on hold before an assistant finally gave him an appointment with Arthur Vance. The assistant had laughed when Thomas told her the dispute was over a $400 account fee. Mr. Vance usually handles multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring, she had said, her voice dripping with condensation. But he has a mandatory pro bono and small claims mediation slot open on Thursday morning for 30 minutes. I'll put you down. Which brings us right back to the cold room, the mahogany table, and the 7 words. We don't waste time on pocket change. In the high-rise office, Arthur Vance looks down at the yellowed piece of paper Thomas has placed on top of the $50 waiver. Arthur's watch ticks. The sound is tiny but distinct in the silent room. Arthur sighs, a theatrical display of exhaustion. Mr. Jennings, I don't have time to read historical artifacts. If this is a copy of your mother's original account agreement, it is completely irrelevant. That account was opened with First National. First National was bought by Century Trust in 1984. Century Trust was absorbed by Allied Bank Group in 1997, and we acquired Allied in 2004. Every single one of those mergers nullified previous fee structures. The current fee schedule governs the account. Period. I know, Thomas says softly. I track the merger history. It's fascinating stuff, especially the 1997 acquisition. Your bank bought Allied's assets, but you also legally assumed 100% of their liabilities and prior contractual obligations. It's right there in your 2004 SEC filing. Page 112. Arthur pauses. His hand, which had been reaching for his gold fountain pen to dismiss Thomas, hovers for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrow. You read our SEC filings? I had a free Tuesday, Thomas says simply. Now please, read line 14. Arthur frowns. He picks up the yellowed paper. He unfolds it. His eyes scan down the page, past the faded typewriter ink, until they find the bold letters, Section 14. He begins to read silently. At first, his face is blank. It's the face of a man reading a grocery list. But then, the corners of Arthur's mouth twitch downward. The silence in the room deepens. The air feels heavier. The text in Section 14 states that in exchange for an initial, non-refundable sovereign tier deposit of $10,000, which Margaret Jennings had deposited in 1969 using her inheritance, the bank guaranteed that the account would be entirely free from any maintenance, operational, or administrative charges for the lifetime of the depositor and their immediate heirs. That was standard enough for 1969 VIP accounts. But it was the next sentence that made the blood begin to drain from Arthur Vance's face. In the event that the institution, or any of its legal successors, shall mistakenly or purposefully withhold, freeze, or penalize funds within this account under any nomenclature not explicitly authorized by the depositor, such withholding shall be deemed a material breach of contract. As remedy, the institution agrees to pay a daily noncompliance penalty equal to 1.5% of the total account balance at the time of breach, compounded monthly, retroactive to the date of the first unauthorized transaction, until such time as the breach is cured. Arthur stops reading. He looks up at Thomas. His corporate smile is completely gone. His face is rigid. This is ridiculous, Arthur says, though his voice is slightly higher than it was 2 minutes ago. This is a standard boilerplate penalty clause from 40 years ago. It's unenforceable. It violates modern banking regulations regarding punitive damages. Actually, it doesn't, Thomas says, leaning back in his chair and crossing his legs. It's not a punitive damage clause. It's a liquidated damages provision for a sovereign tier deposit contract. It was fully legal under the National Banking Act of 1933, which was the active governing law when this contract was signed. And under the successorship clause of your 2004 merger, you accepted all active contracts without modification unless agreed upon by both parties. Thomas leans forward, placing his elbows on the mahogany table. My mother never signed a modification. Neither did I, which means, Mr. Vance, that when your system automatically took that $400 out of her account 3 months ago, you didn't just take $400. Thomas points a finger at the paper. You triggered Section 14. Arthur Vance laughs. It's a nervous, sharp sound. Mr. Jennings, even if this absurd clause were valid, which it isn't, 1.5% a day on a $400 dispute for 90 days is, what, a few $1,000s? If you think our legal department is going to tremble over a $5,000 contract error, you are severely mistaken. Thomas doesn't get defensive. He just reaches into his folder and pulls out a single sheet of paper covered in neat, typed rows of numbers. He slides it across to Arthur. "You're doing the math wrong, Arthur," Thomas says, using the executive's first name for the first time. "You're calculating the penalty based on the withdrawn amount. That's not what the contract says." Thomas taps the paper. The contract says 1.5% daily on the total account balance at the time of breach. Arthur looks down at the sheet of numbers. At the time of the breach, Thomas explains calmly, "My mother's total account balance was $42,450. That was her life savings. Your system didn't just touch the $400. It compromised an account holding $42,000. Arthur's eyes jump to the bottom of Thomas's spreadsheet. There is a number highlighted in bright yellow. It is not $5,000. It is not $50,000. The number at the bottom of the page is $18,412,600. Arthur Vance's breath hitches. He actually blinks rapidly, as if trying to clear a blur from his vision. 18 million? Arthur whispers. "Compounding interest is a beautiful thing, isn't it?" Thomas says, his tone completely conversational. 1.5% a day, compounded monthly over 90 days on a $42,000 base balance, plus the historical continuity multiplier from the 1997 Allied merger agreement, which specified a triple damage clause for unresolved legacy disputes older than 30 years. Thomas smiles. It's a gentle, grandfatherly smile. "You see, Arthur, when your bank swallowed Allied Bank, you didn't just buy their branches. You bought their ghosts. And this ghost has been waiting since 1969. The room becomes completely silent. The executive coffee on the side table is getting cold. Arthur Vance looks at the yellowed 1969 document. Then he looks at Thomas's spreadsheet. Then he looks at Thomas. For the first time in his 30-year career, Arthur Vance doesn't know what to say. His mind is racing through defenses. Statute of limitations? No, the breach just happened 90 days ago. Unconscionability? Hard to argue when the bank drafted the original document themselves in 1969 to lure high-net-worth clients. This is an extortionate interpretation of a clerical error. Arthur stammers, his voice losing all of its smooth, corporate authority. "It's not an interpretation," Thomas corrects him softly. "It's the contract your bank signed. The same contract you told me to choose wisely about 2 minutes ago." Thomas stands up. He buttoned his faded tweed jacket. "I'll give you 24 hours to verify the math with your actuary team. If I don't hear from you by 9 a.m. Friday morning, my lawyer will file the formal complaint in federal district court. And since it's a federal contract dispute over a historical banking charter, it becomes a matter of public record." Thomas walks toward the heavy oak door. He stops, looks back over his shoulder, and smiles. "Oh, and Arthur, don't worry about wasting time on pocket change. I think 18 million is worth at least an hour of your afternoon." The moment the heavy door clicks shut behind Thomas, the calm, sterile atmosphere of Arthur Vance's office evaporates into pure, unadulterated chaos. Arthur doesn't call his assistant. He doesn't call his legal team. He locks his office door, sits down at his computer, and pulls up the bank's internal historical archives. These are archives that normal employees don't even know exist. Digitized records of every charter, treaty, and contract from every tiny local bank their corporation had absorbed over the last 50 years. It takes him 2 hours to find a 1969 First National Sovereign Tier Master Charter. When it loads onto his high-definition screen, Arthur's hands are actually sweating. He scrolls through the digital scans of the ancient microfilm until he finds it. Section 14. The wording is identical to the piece of paper Thomas had placed on his desk. Word for word. Comma for comma. Arthur drops his head into his hands. The math wasn't wrong. In fact, Thomas had been conservative. He hadn't factored in the additional state-level electronic banking penalties that had been passed in 2008, which could potentially push the liability closer to $22 million. But the money wasn't even the biggest problem for the bank. The real problem was the precedent. In 1969, First National Bank had issued exactly 412 of these sovereign-tier accounts to wealthy local business owners, farmers, and doctors to fund their initial expansion. If Thomas filed this lawsuit in open federal court, it would become public. Every investigative journalist, every class action attorney and every descendant of those 412 original account holders would find out about Section 14. If even 10% of those accounts have been hit with modern automated maintenance fees over the last 20 years, the total liability wouldn't be 18 million. It would be in the billions. It could literally destabilize the bank's entire retail division. At 2 p.m., Arthur Vance calls a secret emergency meeting in the executive boardroom on the top floor. The room is filled with the bank's top minds: the chief financial officer, the head of risk management, the senior executive VP of public relations, and the chairman of the board, an old man named Sterling who usually only shows up for annual shareholder gala events. Arthur lays out the documents on the massive glass table. He explains Thomas's visit. He shows them the math. For 10 minutes, nobody speaks. The only sound is the rustling of paper and the low hum of the air conditioning. Finally, the CFO looks up. His face is pale. "Is the contract valid?" he asks. "Yes," Arthur says, his voice tight. "It survived 4 mergers because of a specific clause in a 1997 Allied acquisition agreement that protected legacy deposits to avoid a run on the bank at the time. We missed it during the 2004 due diligence because it was filed under inactive historical charters." "Can we fight it in court?" the chairman, Sterling, asks. His voice is raspy but sharp. "We can try," Arthur says. "But if we do, the filings become public. The moment a class action firm gets their hands on Section 14, they will run commercials during the Super Bowl looking for legacy First National account holders. We'll be fighting a war on 400 fronts." Sterling looks out the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city below, where millions of normal, everyday people are walking past their ATM machines. "What does the man want?" Sterling asks. "He wants his $400, Arthur says. "No, he doesn't," Sterling snaps. "If he wanted $400, he would have taken the $50 credit and left. He wants what he knows he's owed. Call him. Offer him a settlement." Now, at 4:30 p.m., Thomas is sitting in his living room. He's wearing his old slippers. He's watching a baseball game on television with a bowl of unbuttered popcorn in his lap. The phone on the end table rings. Thomas doesn't rush to answer it. He lets it ring 3 times before he picks up the receiver. "Hello, Mr. Jennings." Arthur Vance's voice comes through the line. It doesn't sound like the voice of a man who sits in a $3,000 suit anymore. It sounds tired, anxious. "Thank you for taking my call. I've reviewed your documentation with our senior executive committee." "And?" Thomas asks, his eyes still on the television. The batter swings and misses. "Strike 2. While we maintain that your mathematical calculation is legally speculative, the bank values its relationship with the community and the legacy of our original depositors. We would like to resolve this matter immediately, without the need for prolonged litigation." "I'm listening," Thomas says. "We are prepared to offer you a cash settlement of $250,000, Arthur says, trying to inject some authority back into his tone. "In exchange, you will sign a strict, non-disclosure agreement regarding the 1969 charter, and you will surrender the original physical copy of your mother's account agreement to our custody." $250,000. To a retired county land surveyor, that is a massive amount of money. It's enough to pay off his modest mortgage, buy a brand new car, and put a significant amount away for his grandchildren's college funds. Arthur Vance holds his breath on the other end of the line, waiting for the gasp, the hesitation, the inevitable acceptance. But Thomas just takes a handful of popcorn. He chews slowly. $250,000 is a lot of money, Arthur, Thomas says calmly. "It is," Arthur agrees quickly. "It's a very generous offer, Mr. Jennings. We can have the wire transfer in your account by tomorrow noon." "But it's not 18 million, Thomas says, his voice flat. Arthur's voice drops an octave. "Mr. Jennings, let's be realistic. You are an individual. We are a global institution. If you take this to court, we will drag it out. It will take 5, maybe 7 years before you ever see a courtroom. You are 62 years old. Do you really want to spend the next decade of your life in depositions, paying lawyers 50% of whatever you might eventually win?" It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic. The threat of time, the threat of mortality. But Arthur had made one critical mistake. He He didn't understand the psychology of a title researcher. "Arthur," Thomas says, his tone almost parental. "You think I'm afraid of waiting? I spent 32 years looking at microfilm in a basement archive. I spent 3 years tracking down a single property line boundary from an 1860 land grant just to prove an arrogant developer had stolen 4 inches of a widow's garden. I have nothing but time." Thomas takes another piece of popcorn. "Your offer is declined. Don't call me again unless that number has at least 7 figures and the first digit isn't a 2. Thomas hangs up the phone. He goes back to watching the baseball game. The next morning, at 8:15 a.m., exactly 45 minutes before Thomas's deadline, a sleek black town car pulls up to Thomas's modest suburban house. Arthur Vance doesn't send an assistant this time. He comes himself. He walks up the concrete steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He knocks on the door. Thomas opens it, holding a mug of coffee. He's wearing his frayed gray tweed jacket. "Arthur," Thomas says, not looking surprised at all. "You're early. Can I come in?" Arthur asks. He looks exhausted. There are dark circles under his eyes. He hasn't slept in 24 hours. Thomas steps aside. Arthur walks into the small living room. It smells like cinnamon toast and old books. It's a world completely foreign to a man who spent his life in glass skyscrapers. Arthur doesn't sit down. He places a new, thick black leather portfolio on Thomas's coffee table. $3.5 million, Arthur says, his voice a whisper. That is the absolute maximum the board authorized. It is structured as a structural consulting retainer for your mother's estate, spread over 3 years for tax purposes, but paid up front into an escrow account today. Thomas looks at the portfolio. $3.5 million, Thomas repeats. Yes, Arthur says. And a full, unconditional reversal of the $400 fee, with a formal written apology from the CEO for the automated billing error. Thomas walks over to the window. He looks out at his 12-year-old sedan with the dent in the passenger door. He thinks about his mother, Margaret. He thinks about her saving rubber bands and washing out plastic bags. He thinks about how she had been treated like a number on a ledger by a young branch manager who couldn't be bothered to look up from his screen. This wasn't about $18 million anymore. It was never really about $18 million. Thomas knew the federal courts would likely have eventually reduced the total amount under equitable remedy laws anyway. But $3.5 million? That was real. That was definitive. That was a number that represented complete, undeniable surrender from an institution that thought it was untouchable. Thomas turns back around. The NDA, Thomas says, does it apply to me, or does it apply to the documents? Both, Arthur says quickly. You cannot speak about the terms, and the original 1969 agreement must be placed in our private repository. Thomas nods. He reaches into his breast pocket and pulls out the yellowed, folded piece of paper. He places it on top of the black leather portfolio. There's just one more thing, Arthur. Arthur tenses. What? The local branch in my neighborhood. The manager there is a young man named Kevin. Thomas smiles gently. I want you to call Kevin. Right now from my kitchen phone. And I want you to explain to him exactly why the bank is reversing a $400 fee today. Word for word. Arthur Vance stares at Thomas for a long, agonizing moment. The senior vice president of legal affairs, a man who dictates terms to multinational corporations, slowly walks into Thomas's modest kitchen. He picks up the old quarter-wall phone. He dials the branch number. Kevin, Arthur says, his voice strained. This is Arthur Vance from Corporate Legal. I need you to pull up account registry ending in 4-0-9-2. Yes, Margaret Jennings. I need you to manually credit that account $400 immediately. Why? Because, Kevin, Arthur looks through the kitchen doorway at Thomas, who is calmly taking a sip of his coffee. Because it turns out we do have time for pocket change. The paperwork was signed on the kitchen table at 8:45 a.m. By noon, the escrow account was verified. Thomas's mortgage was gone. His grandchildren's futures were secure. Thomas didn't buy a mansion. He didn't buy a sports car. He kept his 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the door, though he did finally get the left cuff of his favorite tweed jacket repaired by a local tailor. A month later, Thomas was walking past that same local bank branch. Through the glass double doors, he saw Kevin sitting at his neat little desk, wearing his neat little tie. But Kevin wasn't looking bored anymore. He was staring intensely at his computer screen, reading a new, 20-page internal compliance directive that corporate had issued to every branch in the country. A directive that mandated a manual, human review of every single account older than 30 years before any fee could be assessed. Thomas didn't go inside. He just smiled, adjusted his glasses, and kept walking down the street. The big banks think they own the world because they have the algorithms, the skyscrapers, and the billions of dollars in assets. They think they can rewrite the rules whenever it suits them, hiding behind automated systems and layers of corporate arrogance. But every now and then, the system leaves a door unlocked. And every now and then, a man like Thomas comes along with a yellow highlighter, a cup of black coffee, and all the time in the world to open it. If you found yourself cheering for Thomas and his mother's memory, let's bring this story into the comments. I have a question for you.